Got to make brackets to hold those radios in the instrument panel. I've made up a little, just a real rough drawing of what I want for the comm radio. I took the measurements off of the bracket, the box, the case that it slides into, the mount that it slides into. And then I'll make another box similar to that to mount underneath it for the VHF radio. So I've got my sheet of 30 thousandths 2024 laid out. I've got it measured 22 inches long, which is going to be more than long enough for the two of them. I didn't cut that into that corner because you always wind up cutting through the corner. I'll just go ahead and break it off of there. That way I don't have a big long cutout past this corner here. Well, there's a piece I need. Now I got to put the rest of it away. I'm going to take a deburring tool and just run along these edges just to try to smooth them out just a little bit. I have my first one laid out, my first mount laid out. And this is the tray here for the comm radio that's going to mount on it, and it'll sit right in there on that, like that. So this is the body, or the bottom part of it. Probably put some lightning holes in it just to get more air circulation up through the panel. And these ears will fold up, and then the sides of this mounting tray will screw right to these, and then this line right here, this flange will fold down so that the ears will be out on it, and that's what will mount to the instrument panel. And these are only going to be a 1/2 inch, so I'm going to trim that down, but I need to probably drill a hole here at the intersection of these lines to relieve those bends, and then I'll need to cut down this line on these two right here, because this bend will fold up, this ear will stick out this way, this flange will go down, and this one will go to the other direction. And those will go flat against the instrument panel, the back side of it, and rivet onto it. I messed up on my first attempt to make this mount bracket for the tray for the comm radio. Didn't look too bad. The problem, well, a couple of small problems. One, I'd intended to make these bends out here with my brake, a little Grizzly 3-in-1 brake, and then make these other bends here to fold these sides up with, and it'd been nice clean bends on there, folds on there, and would have been real good. But the problem was that I didn't anticipate, I forgot that this thing won't bend. There's no way to make these reverse bends. If I was making a box with these bends coming in, then I could have removed fingers and stuff and set up for making these bends. But with them going out like that, they really won't fit in the machine. You know, you go to make this bend and this thing is going to be down on the table, and there's no way to make that clear. Well, I could cut these out a little bit wider here where I cut the reliefs out for these corners, and maybe it would bridge that bending plate on the bottom. I wound up just bending them by hand with a hand seamer, and that worked out okay. And these bends here for the sides, they came out okay. Problem was I got a little too tight, and with this 2024 T3 is just so stiff that once you make a bend in it, you can't really straighten it out and redo it. But once you get this piece of metal put in there, you can't really see where your line is on the die to make your turn, so it's real easy to get it off one way or the other. And that's kind of what I did. I got it a little too tight. I went ahead and did it again. I'm not 100% happy with it because my seaming tool that I used to make these bends, it was just cheap Harbor Freight tool, and it broke when I was trying to straighten these out. So I've got a Teta vice grip style seaming pliers, and they don't work near as good for making these bends, so I didn't get near as good a bends on here as what on the other one is what I'd like. But it's serviceable, it'll work, it fits in there, and I got it drilled and clecoed onto the instrument panel. So now I need to go ahead and make another tray for that comm radio. Now, because I've hand cut both long sides of this, they're not exactly square anymore, and then the one side was cut in the middle, and that's not square. I've sheared off the one cut edge here on this piece to get a nice clean straight edge on it, and now I'm going to go ahead and make a square this other edge up with that edge. I've taken my combination square there and drew lines on both sides of it, both edges of it there to make it square. And I know the combination square is pretty close to being square because I checked it with a short machinist square before I did that, but it's just not long enough to span that full width. So I used the combination square to get across there to square it up to this face over here. One of the things I just learned watching YouTube was one way to get a nice square edge, an accurate cut. When you put this in the machine, of course it's got a dog on there, stop on one side that's supposed to act as a square. Those things are never accurate. You very seldom get an accurate line on it, and then getting the lines lined up against the shear can be a little bit of a hassle. You always wind up with one side in a little farther than the other. This guy on YouTube, I think I saw it in a couple places, but basically take a left-hand cutter and put right on your line where you want, and you'd actually do this with a rule if you had the rule. But the left-hand cutter, one blade is going to go down, and the other, well, all the cutters really, one blade goes up and one blade goes down. So that'll force one side, the cutoff side, down. If I do that, and I put that right on that line, just shear that in just a little ways, and so that just puts that down just a little bit. And we'll take the other side and take a right-hand cutter and do the same thing. Put that right on my line and make a cut. Just a little bit, doesn't take very much. That does the same thing. That just puts just a little bit of a lip, just a tab on that. Now, when I want to make where I want to make my cut, those two tabs go down on each side, and you put that in there and just pull it back, and those tabs then stop right against that plate, on that bottom plate of the shear. Both sides are now lined up with that cutter, with that bar. And so when you make the cut, you make a nice straight cut, and that is going to be as close to perfectly square as we can get it in this circumstances, but makes a nice cut there. So now I've got two clean edges and a square edge and a straight edge on two sides that I can work off of to lay out my pattern. I've got this laid out. This is the radio that this is going to hold, and I measured this out. Actually, I went and took the dial calipers and measured across, and it was 5.5 inches. And then I measured how high it was from the bottom of the radio up to the bottom of this tray that I'm putting it on. I'm going to mount it underneath the tray that I made for the other radio. I wanted 3.3 inches high on these side legs, arms, whatever, and then a 1/2 inch flange on each side for riveting. That all came out to what would it come out to? 9.85 total width of this thing. So I measured that out from this edge over, and then I took half of that, which came out to 4.925, and I made a center line here. That's where the center line of this tray is going to be. This mount's going to be right there, and I made a center line, and then I measured, took half of the width, the 5.55, which is 2.725, and that give me, on both sides, that give me my flat area that the tray, the mount, radio is going to mount in. So that should leave 3.3 inches there, and plus the 0.5 inches for the flange. And let's see how we did there. Uh-oh. That's not right. That's only 2 point. So I did something wrong there. Okay, good thing I checked on that. Now we'll have to, yeah, that's only 2 inches. So I'm going to have to do my math and everything over again here and figure this all out again. Crud, thought I had it. Oh, I know what I did. I only added one 3.3 instead of two 3.3s. That's what I did wrong. Okay, so it should be 6.6 added on there to 5.55. Alright, now I got that figured out. We'll go ahead and make a correction. Alright, I got it laid out right this time. I had to do it twice. I had to do it 3 times actually. The first time, of course, I didn't add the 3.3 to both sides. I only added 3.3 once, and that made it way too narrow. I only had 2 inches of height on each one of these sides. So then I added the 3.3 on and measured it out, marked it, and I got to looking at it, and I forgot to put the 1/2 inch for the lips on there. So I added everything up again and redid it, and now it looks pretty good. Now I'll go ahead and trim this up, and I'll go ahead and do like I did with that first one. I'll take my shears and just make a cut on these 2 lines, cut off this short section first, and then I'll do the same thing on this line here on this side, on both sides of it, and cut off that. The reason is it's easier to cut the short section, and this is going to be, if I cut this whole long section here, it's harder to shear than it would be if I cut this off and then I basically almost cut it. I've got an idea on how to get the bends cleaner on these flanges here. I'm going to take, I measured the width of that bottom plate, the V plate, and it's 8/10 of an inch. So I'm going to take this rotor broach, I'm going to go ahead and drill my relief holes out on these where these bends go, and go ahead and round those out, file them out and everything, so that I'll have enough clearance to fit over that flange, and then I can go ahead and make this bend on this flange, and then I can make my bends, reverse bends on these other pieces here. I got my piece all ready to start folding up. I got the notches all cut out for it and deburred, sanded down, all my edges sanded and cleaned. So my first bend now, I've got these notches real wide on here, wider than what I'd normally make, and down a little deeper, so hopefully they'll clear those that bottom plate on that brake, so we can bend these make these other bends. Now, I have a hard time seeing where that line is and making a nice clean straight bend on there, because once you put this up underneath that brake, this line disappears underneath those fingers. So I took and measured that, and that was 8/10 of an inch across the bottom of that lower brake, or part of the brake, the die part of it. Then I took and measured from the center of the V and the fingers, and it's 4/10 of an inch to the outside. So I went ahead and measured 4/10 of an inch back from where my bend is, and took these Cleco sheet clamps and just clamped this piece of angle on there, and I should be able to slide that in there and get a good accurate straight bend on that for a change. Okay. Alright, that gives me a nice bend. Pretty close to 9. I might do that a little bit, just a little bit more. It's not quite 90 on this side here, but it is right on the line. Got a nice bend right on my line there. I'll put one of these spring clamps on there. That's working just fine. had to take the spring clamp off in the middle of the bend, but that was alright, so you've already got a good idea where the bend is then. Okay, I've got the flanges bent in it. Now it's time to bend the main bends. I've got them marked. Got my stop put in. Let's see how that works. Okay. Do the other side. Okay. That looks good. That looks real good. A little overbent on this side. Not bad. Perfect. Perfect. We got my radio mounts figured out finally. This one here will be for the marine radio, and this is for the comm radio. And it took me 3 tries for the comm radio and 2 for the marine radio to get it figured out. I did the first one for the comm radio. It turned out okay, except it was too tight through the body for the radio. It squeezed in too tight and that pushed those sides out. And there's not much you can do with this 2024 T3. Once you get it bent, you can't unbend it and rebend it. So anyway, I did it again, and second time it turned out better. It fit right, but I didn't like the way these flanges turned out. I had to bend these flanges by hand, and my hand seamer broke. My good hand seamer broke. Actually, it wasn't that good. It's just a Harbor Freight or cheap store knockoff, and I used the vice grip style, and they're just not as good for bending. But I didn't like the bends, but it's going to be behind this panel, so it wouldn't make any difference. So anyway, I mounted it up anyway, and it would have worked okay. So then I went ahead and, but like I said, I had to bend these by hand. I come up with the idea of relieving these corners more so that they would clear the flange on this bender, on this brake. Well, here's the flange here. Normally, with just a small relief in here, when you got this reverse flange, when you stick that in there, the flanges would bump into that, and you can't make a bend in the opposite direction on the outside. So I come up with the idea of opening these reliefs up. I cut these cut the holes out with 3/4 inch rotobroach tool, and then trimmed them out and filed them out to fit so that they cleared over this, which is 7/8 of an inch. It would have been better. I could have just cut these out square, 7/8 of an inch, and then rounded them out, or relieved them out, and probably not got as deep of cutout in here as what I did. But anyway, that wound up making a lot nicer bend, and I was able to bend these flanges and then stick it in and bend the other flanges for the box the other direction, and that fit on there. And this wound up being a little bit tight for the radio too. I measured it out pretty careful, but it still wound up being a little bit tight, which wouldn't have hurt anything, except I had bent the top where it mounts onto the bottom of this upper radio rack, the comm radio rack. This would have mounted onto the comm radio rack like this. And once I got it fitted up there, mathematically it worked out, but once I got it fitted up there, I could see there just wasn't, I just didn't like the amount of clearance I had here between the edge of this upper comm radio rack and this one for the flange to rivet them together. So I went ahead and cut out another piece of metal, and I bent up another flange for the comm radio, and that one came out real nice. That worked out a lot better. I said it won't make any difference because nobody will see it. Then I bent up a box for the VHF radio, marine radio, and I just bent it up as a box with these flanges coming out on the where they mount up to the instrument panel. But I just made a small 1/2-inch flange on the top here, coming in, making that into a box, and that gives me a lot better clearance for my rivets and stuff on there. That looks a lot nicer, a lot neater. And this box fits almost perfect. It's just a little bit wide on that comm radio, but nothing that it can be pulled in with the screws, or if I put a washer underneath the screws on one side, it'll be just fine. So that's a lot nicer. I've got this all clecoed in together and fitted up onto the instrument panel. I'll go ahead and dimple these holes here where it goes from the comm radio into the VHF radio. I'll dimple those holes and rivet that together. Then I'll go ahead and powder coat this thing. I still have to drill out some holes for the mounting screws for both radios, for the tray for the comm radio and for the marine radio. Anyway, that's my radio panel. Those are all, I'm happy with these now. I got my radio rack pretty much done. Pretty happy with it. Got the tray for the comm radio mounted in. I put a nut plate on the sides of it there. That should hold it plenty. Originally the one, Cup Crafters one, had it mounted with an angle bracket that was riveted onto the instrument panel, and it went right in here in these front two mounts, screws. I could still put nut plates on there, but it's pretty tight in there on the back side of that bend. But I put them back in here on the back, and that holds it down pretty darn good, I think. Got my holes here for the comm radio, for the VHF marine radio, and those line up real well. I riveted in this comm radio mount into the or the marine radio mount to the comm radio mount. Got a little hole here. I'm going to put a little cable clamp on the cross tube there underneath the instrument panel, and mount this to that to help hold it rigid and to hold it off of that cross tube there. But everything fits in there pretty good. The next thing to do on this now will be to go ahead and take the paper off of the bottom here. I've got the paper off the top. I'll just go ahead and take the paper off of it and powder coat it, and I think it'll be ready to go. Well, here's what the radios look like with the rack put in there and installed. This comm radio is not in all the way yet. It's still, I haven't got it screwed in to mate up with the rack, so it's still sticking out a little bit, but it's going to be flush against the instrument panel, and this is what it looks like on the back. And that was putting a lot of weight, kind of bending stress on this instrument panel. To start with, it kind of moved it back a little bit, but I put this little clamp down here on that diagonal tube, and it's a cushion clamp, and then I screwed it into the bottom of that tray, and that stiffened that up a whole bunch. That's looking pretty good now. Here's the radio mount now. You get little vent holes there for the comm radio, and got it powder coated up. It's ready to install. Looks pretty good once you get some paint on it. Well, here's my radio trays, or mount. Tray fits in it. It's looking pretty good. It's ready to go in the instrument panel.